The blood-red sun dipped below the dusty horizon of Fort Stockton, Texas, when Willa Patterson collapsed at the altar, her white wedding dress billowing around her like a cloud as she whispered the words that would change everything. "I'm dying." The year was 1879, and Zachary Redfield stood frozen before her, his weathered cowboy hands trembling as they reached for his bride. The small wooden church fell silent, the assembled townsfolk holding their collective breath as Zachary knelt beside Willa, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "Then live with me first," he said, gathering her into his arms. Willa's auburn hair had come loose from its pins, framing her pale face as she looked up at him with those hazel eyes that had captured his heart 6 months earlier. "The doctor gave me a year at most. The consumption, it's spreading." Zachary lifted her as if she weighed nothing, turning to face the stunned preacher and their guests. "Finish the ceremony," he commanded. "I'm still taking her as my wife." The preacher hesitated, Bible clutched in his gnarled hands. "Son, perhaps we should—" "Now," Zachary insisted, his voice breaking just slightly as he held Willa's trembling form. "We'll have our vows in whatever time God grants us after." The townsfolk murmured among themselves as Willa weakly nodded her consent. Her mother wept silently in the front pew, while her father stood stoically beside her, his face a mask of grief. Zachary had arrived in Fort Stockton the previous spring, driving cattle north from his family's ranch near San Antonio. He had stopped in town for supplies and caught sight of Willa teaching children their letters outside the general store. He had stayed an extra day, then another, finding excuses to linger until he'd gathered the courage to speak to her. "Do you, Zachary Redfield, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" the preacher asked, his voice solemn in the hushed church. Zachary never hesitated. "I do. In sickness and in health, till death do us part, and I aim to make that part as far away as possible." Willa's eyes glistened with tears as she repeated her vows, her voice barely audible but determined. When Zachary slipped the simple gold band onto her finger, he made a silent promise to whatever higher power might be listening that he would not lose her so easily. "You may kiss your bride," the preacher announced, closing his Bible. Zachary bent down, pressing his lips gently to Willa's. She tasted of salt and sweetness, of promises and heartbreak. "I love you," he whispered against her mouth, "and that's not changing because of some doctor's opinion." As he carried her back down the aisle, the townsfolk parted, some offering sad smiles, others averting their eyes as if her illness might be contagious. Willa's best friend, Clara, pressed a handkerchief to her face, unable to hide her tears. Outside the church, Zachary's horse stood waiting, adorned with ribbons for the occasion. He carefully lifted Willa onto the saddle, then mounted behind her, cradling her against his chest as they rode toward the small house he'd built at the edge of town. It wasn't much 2 rooms with a view of the distant hills, but he'd constructed it with his own hands, planning for a future he now feared might be slipping away. "Are you angry with me?" Willa asked as they approached their home, her voice thin against the evening wind. "For not telling you sooner?" Zachary's arms tightened around her waist. "I'm not angry. I'm determined." "To do what?" she asked. "To prove that doctor wrong." That night, instead of the passionate wedding night they'd planned, Zachary bathed Willa's fevered brow as she coughed until her ribs ached. He brewed the herbal tea her mother had prepared, adding honey to soothe her throat. When she finally slept, he sat beside their bed, watching the rise and fall of her chest, counting each breath as if it were precious gold. In the morning light, Willa seemed stronger. She insisted on getting up, on wearing the blue dress she'd sewn for her first day as a married woman rather than the nightgown she'd slept in. "I won't be treated like I'm already gone," she told him, pinning up her hair with trembling fingers. "If I have a year, then I have a year to live, not a year to die." Zachary watched her, admiring the stubborn set of her jaw, the fire in her eyes that illness hadn't dampened. "What would you like to do today, Mrs. Redfield?" he asked, the name still new and wonderful on his tongue. Willa turned to him, a smile transforming her face. "Take me riding. Show me your favorite places. I want to know everything about this land you love." They spent that day on horseback, Willa seated in front of Zachary, his arms steady around her. He showed her the creek where he'd fished as a boy, the ancient oak where his father had carved his initials, the distant mountains that had always called to him. Willa drank it all in, asking questions about his childhood, his dreams, as if storing away pieces of him for safekeeping. When her breathing grew labored in the afternoon heat, Zachary turned them toward home, ignoring her protests. "We have time," he reminded her. "Not everything needs to be done today." That evening, Dr. Mitchell visited, his medical bag in hand and a grave expression on his weathered face. He listened to Willa's lungs, checked her pulse, and frowned at the fever that had returned. "You should be resting," he admonished her, "not gallivanting across the countryside on your wedding day." "With all due respect, doctor," Willa replied, "if rest was the cure for consumption, sanatoriums wouldn't be filled with bedridden patients who never recover." The doctor sighed, closing his bag. "Mrs. Redfield, I understand your desire to live fully with the time you have, but overtaxing your strength will only hasten the end." Zachary, who had been leaning against the doorframe, stepped forward. "Is there nothing else to be done? I've heard of treatments in Europe, in the mountains." "There are experimental treatments, yes," Dr. Mitchell admitted reluctantly. "Some doctors believe the dry air of Colorado or Arizona might help. Others recommend sea air. But these are theories, not guarantees." After the doctor left, Zachary found Willa standing by the window, her silhouette framed by the setting sun. "We're going," he said simply. She turned, confusion crossing her features. "Going where?" "Colorado, Arizona, the sea. Wherever might help you. We'll try them all if we have to." "Zach, we can't afford—" "I've been saving," he interrupted, "for our future. This is our future." Tears welled in Willa's eyes. "You heard the doctor. There are no guarantees." Zachary crossed the room, taking her hands in his. "The only guarantee I need is that I'll be with you, fighting this together. Will you trust me, Willa?" The next morning, they began making preparations. Zachary sold most of their wedding gifts, keeping only those with sentimental value. He spoke with his former boss at the cattle company, securing a promise of work in Colorado where they were planning to head first. Willa's parents were less supportive. Her father, a stern man who had never fully approved of Zachary, called him a fool for taking a dying woman on a wild goose chase. Her mother cried, begging Willa to spend her remaining time surrounded by family. "I am with family," Willa told them firmly. "Zachary is my husband now, and if there's even a chance this might help, I have to try." They departed Fort Stockton 1 week after their wedding, their possessions packed into a wagon Zachary had purchased second-hand. Willa sat beside him on the bench, wrapped in blankets despite the warm Texas morning. A small crowd gathered to see them off, friends, neighbors, and Willa's tearful parents, who had relented at the last moment and brought food for their journey. "Take care of my daughter," Willa's father said gruffly, shaking Zachary's hand. "With my life," Zachary promised. The journey north was grueling. Willa's health fluctuated day by day. Some mornings she woke energetic, chatting and pointing out wildflowers along their route. Other days she could barely lift her head, and Zachary would make camp early, holding her through the night as she shivered and coughed. They reached Denver after 3 weeks on the road. The city was booming, a far cry from the sleepy town of Fort Stockton. Noise and dust filled the streets, and Zachary feared he'd made a terrible mistake bringing Willa to such a bustling place. But she rallied in the mountain air. The dry climate seemed to ease her breathing, and the doctor they consulted in Denver offered more hope than Dr. Mitchell had. "The consumption hasn't progressed as far as I'd feared from your description," Dr. Wilson told them after examining Willa. "I've seen patients recover with proper care in this climate." Zachary found work with a rancher outside the city, and they rented a small cabin nearby. Each morning, he'd help Willa to the porch where she could sit wrapped in quilts, breathing the pine-scented air while he worked. Each evening, he'd return to find her a little stronger, a little more present. "You were right," she told him one night as they sat by the fire, her head resting on his shoulder. "I feel better here. Not cured, but better. Zachary pressed a kiss to her temple. That's all I'm asking for. Better today than yesterday. As summer turned to fall, Willa's improvement continued. She gained weight, her cheeks regaining some of their former color. She began taking short walks with Zachary, her hand tucked in the crook of his arm as they explored their new surroundings. I want to learn to shoot, she announced one crisp October morning. Zachary looked up from the fence he was mending. To shoot? Why? Because I'm tired of feeling helpless, she explained. If I'm going to live, I want to live fully. That means being able to protect myself if needed. Though skeptical, Zachary brought home a small revolver the next day. He taught her how to load it, how to aim, how to respect the weapon's power. To his surprise, Willa proved to be a natural markswoman, hitting targets with an accuracy that made him whistle in appreciation. Where did you learn to shoot like that? He asked after she hit a tin can at 30 paces. Willa smiled mysteriously. My father taught me when I was young, before he decided I should be a proper lady instead. As winter approached, however, Willa's health began to decline again. The cold air that had once seemed to invigorate her now sent her into coughing fits that left her gasping for breath. Zachary watched with growing desperation as the progress they'd made slipped away. Dr. Wilson visited regularly, adjusting her treatments and prescribing new mixtures of medicines that provided temporary relief, but no lasting improvement. Perhaps we should try another climate, Zachary suggested one night as he held Willa through a particularly bad spell. Arizona, like Dr. Mitchell mentioned, or California. I've heard the weather there is mild year-round. Willa nodded weakly against his chest. I'll go wherever you think best. They left Denver just after Christmas, heading southwest toward warmer climes. The journey was harder this time. Willa's strength had diminished significantly, and Zachary often had to stop for days at a time when she couldn't travel. In a small town in northern New Mexico, they encountered a Navajo healer who offered Willa a tea made from desert plants. To Zachary's surprise, it seemed to help more than the expensive medicines they'd purchased in Denver. Willa's breathing eased and her fever dropped for the first time in weeks. We should stay here a while, Zachary decided, finding them lodging in the town's only boarding house. At least until you're stronger. They remained in New Mexico for 2 months. The healer, a woman named Najoni, visited daily, bringing her remedies and teaching Willa how to prepare them herself. Under her care, Willa began to improve again, slowly regaining the strength she'd lost during the winter. Your wife has a strong spirit, Najoni told Zachary, but her body is fighting a difficult battle. The sickness may retreat for a time, but it will return unless she finds a place where she can truly heal. Where is such a place? Zachary asked desperately. Najoni considered him for a long moment. I have heard that near the great ocean to the west, there is a valley protected from harsh weather. The air there is clean, and healing plants grow in abundance. Many with lung sicknesses have found relief there. Zachary shared this information with Willa that evening. California, he said. We were already heading that direction. It seems like a sign. Willa sat up in bed, stronger than she'd been in weeks, but still far too thin, her collarbones sharp beneath her nightgown. Zach, we've been traveling for almost 8 months. We've spent nearly all our savings. Maybe it's time to accept. No, he interrupted fiercely. I'm not accepting anything except that we keep fighting. Together. Wasn't that our vow? Tears glistened in Willa's eyes. Yes, but at what cost to you? You've given up everything to chase this impossible cure. Zachary knelt beside the bed, taking her hands in his. I haven't given up anything that matters. You're what matters, Willa. And every day I get to wake up beside you is worth whatever hardship comes with it. They left for California in early spring, traveling slowly through Arizona and into the southern part of the state. The journey took weeks, but Willa seemed to gain strength as they moved westward. By the time they reached the coast, she was able to walk short distances without assistance, breathing deeply of the salt-tinged air. They settled in a small coastal village south of San Francisco, where Zachary found work on a fishing boat. The captain, an older man named Miguel, had lost his own wife to consumption years earlier and took a special interest in the young couple. "The sea air helped my Elena for a time," he told Zachary, "but we didn't come here soon enough. You were wiser than I was." Summer in California brought steady improvement for Willa. The combination of sea air, the herbal remedies they'd learned from Nijoni, and the peaceful rhythm of village life seemed to be the perfect medicine. Color returned to her cheeks and her coughing spells became less frequent. One evening, as they walked along the beach at sunset, Willa stopped suddenly, turning to face the ocean. She took a deep breath, then another, filling her lungs completely without triggering a cough. "Zach," she said wonderingly, "I think I'm getting better, really better." Zachary watched her, afraid to hope too much but unable to deny the evidence before him. Willa looked more like the woman he'd fallen in love with in Fort Stockton than she had since their wedding day. "The local doctor says the same," he admitted. "He examined you last week while you were sleeping. He says your lungs sound clearer than he would have expected, given your history." Willa turned to him, her eyes wide. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't want to get your hopes up, or mine. We've had too many disappointments." She stepped closer, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her head against his chest. "Even if this is temporary, you've already given me more time than I thought I'd have. More life." That night, for the first time since their wedding, they made love. Zachary was gentle, afraid of taxing her strength, but Willa was insistent, pulling him closer, whispering that she needed to feel alive, to feel like a wife rather than a patient. Afterward, as they lay tangled in sheets damp with sea air, Willa traced patterns on his chest. "I want to talk about the future," she said quietly. Zachary's heart stuttered. They'd carefully avoided such discussions, living day by day since her diagnosis. "What about it?" "I want to build a life here. A real life, not just a holding pattern until I get sick again." She propped herself up on one elbow, looking down at him in the moonlight streaming through their window. "I want a home. I want to plant a garden that I'll be here to see bloom. I want—" She hesitated, biting her lip. "What else do you want?" Zachary prompted, reaching up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. "I want children," she whispered. "Your children. If that's still possible for me." Zachary sat up, gathering her into his arms. "Are you sure? The doctor said pregnancy might—" "I know the risks," she interrupted, "but I'm stronger now, and I don't want fear to stop us from living the life we dreamed of." They didn't actively try for a baby, but they stopped preventing it. Zachary built them a small house on a plot of land overlooking the ocean, with wide windows that let in light and air. Willa planted the garden she'd dreamed of, herbs from Nijoni's teachings, vegetables and flowering plants that attracted hummingbirds and butterflies. By their first wedding anniversary, Willa had been without symptoms for 3 months. They celebrated with a picnic on the beach, sharing a bottle of wine as the sun set over the Pacific. "1 year ago today I thought I was dying," Willa said, her head resting in Zachary's lap as he stroked her hair. "Now I feel more alive than I ever have." "I told you," Zachary replied with a grin. "That doctor back in Texas didn't know what he was talking about." Willa laughed, a clear, bell-like sound that Zachary never tired of hearing. "He wasn't entirely wrong. I was very sick. I might have died if we'd stayed." "But we didn't stay," Zachary pointed out. "We fought. We kept moving forward." "We lived," Willa said simply. That autumn, Willa discovered she was pregnant. The news brought both joy and fear, joy at the fulfillment of their deepest wish, fear that the physical strain might trigger a relapse of her illness. The local doctor monitored her closely, as did the midwife who had delivered babies in the village for 30 years. To everyone's relief, Willa's health remained stable. The pregnancy tired her, as it would any woman, but her lungs stayed clear, her fever didn't return. "It's a miracle," the midwife declared after one examination, "or perhaps just the power of love and clean air." Their son was born the following spring, a healthy, robust boy with Zachary's dark hair and Willa's hazel eyes. They named him Samuel, after Zachary's father, who had passed away the previous year, never having met the daughter-in-law who had defied death. "He's perfect," Willa whispered as she held their son for the first time, tears of joy streaming down her face. Absolutely perfect. Zachary could only nod, too overcome with emotion to speak. The fragile bride he'd carried from the church in Fort Stockton was now a strong mother, holding their child. It seemed impossible, yet here they were. Life settled into a new rhythm after Samuel's birth. Zachary continued working on the fishing boats, while Willa tended to their home and child. They received occasional letters from Fort Stockton news from Willa's parents, updates on friends, town gossip. Each letter ended with the same question: when would they return for a visit? "Do you want to go back?" Zachary asked one evening as Willa read the latest letter from her mother. "Just to visit." Willa considered the question, watching their son play on a blanket nearby. "I'd like my parents to meet Samuel," she admitted, "and I miss them. But I'm afraid that you might get sick again if we leave here," Zachary finished for her. She nodded. "Is that foolish? It's been almost 2 years since my last serious episode." "It's not foolish to be cautious," Zachary assured her, "but perhaps we could invite them here instead. The journey would be difficult for them, but if they're willing." The invitation was sent, and to their surprise, Willa's parents agreed immediately. They arrived in California 3 months later, her father looking older than Zachary remembered, her mother weeping openly at the sight of the healthy daughter she'd feared would be dead by now. "It's the air here," Willa explained as they sat on the porch of the house Zachary had built, "and the remedies we learned along the way, and Zach's stubborn refusal to let me die." Her father, who had once been so opposed to their journey, clasped Zachary's hand with both of his. "I was wrong about you, son," he said gruffly. "You saved her when I had already given up hope." "She saved herself," Zachary corrected. "I just provided the transportation." Willa's parents stayed for a month, doting on Samuel and marveling at the life their daughter and son-in-law had created. When they departed, there were tears, but also promises of future visits, a bridge now firmly established between their old life and their new one. As Samuel grew from infant to toddler, Willa's health continued to improve. The local doctor, who had initially been cautious in his prognosis, now declared her among the healthiest women in the village. "Whatever was trying to kill you seems to have given up the fight, Mrs. Redfield," he told her during a checkup. "Your lungs are clear, your heart is strong. I would say you've beaten the odds quite thoroughly." Zachary, who had accompanied her to the appointment, let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for 2 years. "So she's cured? Truly cured?" The doctor hesitated. "I wouldn't use the word cured. Consumption can be dormant for years before returning. But I will say this, I've never seen someone recover as completely as your wife has. Whatever combination of treatments and circumstances you found, it worked." They celebrated that night with a special dinner. Samuel tucked into bed early so they could have time alone. Willa wore the blue dress she'd sewn for their first day of marriage, now let out slightly to accommodate the changes motherhood had brought to her figure. "To beating the odds," Zachary toasted, raising a glass of wine. "To living first," Willa countered with a smile, "just like you said we should." Later, as they lay in bed listening to the sound of waves crashing against the shore, Willa propped herself up on one elbow, studying Zachary's face in the dim light. "I've been thinking," she began. "A dangerous pastime," he teased. She swatted his chest playfully. "Be serious. I've been thinking about others like me, people who've been told they're dying when there might be hope if they could only get to the right place, try the right treatments." Zachary sat up, intrigued. "What are you suggesting?" "I want to open our home to them," Willa said, her expression earnest. "Not many at once, just 1 or 2 at a time. We could offer them a place to heal, share what we've learned. Maybe help them find their own path to recovery." Zachary considered the idea. Their house was small, but they had land. They could build additional rooms if needed. It would be a lot of work, he said slowly. And there's Samuel to consider. Samuel would benefit from growing up understanding compassion and service, Willa countered. And yes, it would be work, but worthwhile work. She took his hand, squeezing it gently. Think of how many people are in the position I was in, Zach, saying goodbye to their loved ones, preparing to die when they might have years ahead of them if only they knew where to go, what to try. Zachary couldn't argue with that. He remembered all too well the desperation he'd felt when Willa had collapsed at the altar, the determination that had driven their journey across half the country. All right, he agreed. We'll start small, perhaps with one patient first, to see if we can truly help. Word spread quickly once they made their intentions known. Dr. Mitchell in Fort Stockton, who had once given Willa a year to live, became one of their strongest advocates, referring patients he couldn't help locally. Within 6 months of their decision, they had welcomed 3 consumptive patients into their expanded home, which Zachary had enlarged with the help of neighbors. Not all survived. The first patient, an older man from Sacramento, arrived too late in his illness for even the beneficial sea air to make a difference. He passed peacefully after 2 weeks in their care, grateful to spend his final days watching the ocean. But others thrived. A young woman from Wyoming regained enough strength to return home to her fiancé. A middle-aged schoolteacher from Oregon recovered sufficiently to resume teaching in the local village. As their reputation grew, so did their facilities. With money saved and contributions from grateful patients, Zachary built a separate building with 4 rooms for guests. Willa, drawing on everything she'd learned during her own illness, became something of an expert in consumption treatment, combining conventional medicines with the herbal remedies Najoni had taught her. 3 years after they'd left Fort Stockton as newlyweds, one healthy, one dying, they stood together on the bluff overlooking their property. Below them, patients rested on porches, breathing in the healing air. Their garden had expanded to include medicinal herbs from across the West. Samuel, now a sturdy toddler, played in the yard under the watchful eye of Willa's mother, who had moved to California permanently after her husband's passing. "Did you ever imagine this?" Willa asked, leaning against Zachary's shoulder. "When you said, 'Live with me first'?" Zachary wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her closer. "I didn't know what would happen," he admitted. "I just knew I wasn't ready to give up on us." Willa turned in his embrace, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. "I'm glad you didn't," she whispered against his lips, "because this life we've built, it's better than anything I could have dreamed of." As the sun set over the Pacific, casting golden light across their healing sanctuary, Zachary silently thanked whatever force had given them this second chance. The woman the doctors had declared dying was now vibrantly alive, helping others find their own path to healing. Their son was growing strong. With a sister on the way, Willa was 4 months pregnant with their second child, her health robust enough that even the cautious local doctor had given his blessing. "I was thinking," Zachary said as they walked back toward their home, hand in hand, "maybe next year we could take that trip back to Fort Stockton, show Samuel and the new baby where we started." Willa smiled up at him, her face radiant in the fading light. "I'd like that. A journey of celebration instead of desperation this time." "A journey of life," Zachary agreed, "just as it always should have been." That night, as they lay in bed with Samuel nestled between them after a nightmare had sent him seeking parental comfort, Zachary watched his wife's peaceful sleeping face. 5 years ago, he'd been a solitary cowboy driving cattle across Texas, never imagining the life that awaited him. Now he was a husband, a father, a healer in his own right, all because he'd refused to accept an ending when it was presented to him. "Live with me first," he had said at the altar, a desperate plea born of love and denial. And she had lived not just with him, but fully, vibrantly, purposefully. Their story, which had begun with a devastating confession on their wedding day, had transformed into something neither of them could have predicted, a testament to hope, to perseverance, to the healing power of love and clean air and stubborn refusal to surrender. As dawn broke over their California sanctuary, Willa opened her eyes to find Zachary watching her. "Good morning," she whispered, careful not to wake their son. Good morning, he replied, reaching across Samuel to touch her cheek. Ready for another day? Willa smiled, placing her hand over his. With you? Always. And so they rose to greet the day together, as they had every morning since that fateful wedding in Fort Stockton, not as a dying bride and her devoted groom, but as partners in a life neither had dared to imagine possible. A life built on 3 simple words that had changed everything. Live with me.